So my name is Jan. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Neural Computation in Bochum at Gregor's lab. And this talk is called Neural Process Models for Intentional States. And in process models, you can already see it will be multiple different models. And this all is an integrative project. So I'm really digging into previous projects here and combining them. So I will present a lot of architectures here. I will not go in all of them in detail, but I hope you will just recognize some bits that you've seen in the past days and maybe then understand what I'm talking about. I will highlight a few pieces, but I will explain not everything in detail, just as a disclaimer up front. So first, maybe a little bit about motivation. So as Gregor said already, there are different ways of dynamic field models, and the spectrum is very broad. And initially, it all started with models that were trying to capture psychophysical data directly from the lab. And maybe the most known one is this A and B study done with Esther Thielen in 2001 already. And there we really tried to fit, or not we, but our line of research tried to fit like the psychophysical data in the lab and explain that. The more recent flavor that we are doing, especially now in our group, is we're trying to model not really psychophysical data, but more concentrated on behavioral competences, like, for example, reaching or the grounding of spatial language. Sometimes, like in the scene representation you've seen yesterday by Raoul, we really try still to keep up the match, but that takes a lot of amount of tuning work. And usually we are more interested in getting some complex behavior done. We are, however, always looking at a single isolated behavior. And of course, the question then comes up, how can we integrate all this to maybe build an autonomous agent? So the question I'm interested in my PhD project is here, how can we use maybe multiple of these behavioral competences to then maybe generate an agent that is somehow intentional and has some autonomous behavior going on? So intentional, that's a bit broad. So for that, we looked at philosophy for inspiration. And in philosophy, there exists really this term intentionality, which means something slightly different from the term intention you're used to. So intentionality describes the capacity of human minds to generate mental states that are about things in the world. So the very general capacity of your mind to refer to something and to represent that. And something or things in the world is here figured very broadly. So things in the world could also be you or even your own mental states. Okay, this is still very broad and philosophical. So we are, of course, interested in how can we take different kinds of representations and how can we use neural processes to really represent them. And because we come from dynamic field theory, we, of course, know that representations need to be somehow stabilized. And then from that, the question results, if we have stable representations, under which conditions are they actually destabilized again? For example, if you think of an intentional state such as perception, that needs to end at some point, right? So you need to destabilize it again. The same doing with an action. You're doing some action like drinking water, you want that to end at some point. So there are some questions to be asked, but this is still way too broad. So we looked further into philosophy, and our group already did this earlier. There was already inspiration by Julius Sandemirskaya from John Searle. So we looked at that, and he defines intentional states as having two components. On the one hand, a content, and on the other, the psychological mode. And the content describes the thing I'm referring to, for example, this flower here. And the psychological mode then describes in which way can I refer to the flower. And Searle then furthermore distinguishes between two directions of fit. One would be the world to mind direction of fit. Here, I have a representation in the mind, and I want the world to fit that. Yeah? So I want to change the world to fit my mind, and this would be the sort of regular intention flavor, right? If I have the intention to pick a flower up, I have a representation to have the flower in my hand, and then I need to change the world by picking up that flower until that fits. And the other direction would be the more perceptual idea. This would be the mind to world direction of fit. So here I want to change my mind to represent the world somehow. So this would be then a perception, for example. I want to change some representations in my brain that make them represent the world as I'm seeing it. So these would be both directions of fit. And Searle further then distinguishes also different modes here. So there's first a temporal aspect. So intention in action describes an action I'm doing right now, and a prior intention would be then a planned action in the future. Similar to perception, that would be something I see right now, like the slides in front of me. And a memory would be a perception of the past, so something I saw yesterday. And then he has these more broader categories of desire and belief. And although these mean many things, especially in philosophy, there's a lot of definition here. We just simplified this to be just the abstractization of these things. So a desire would be something that has to do with wanting a flower, but it doesn't specify how to get there. And a belief would also be not a single instance or perception or memory, but it would rather be a general rule that we know about the world. So here belief might be synonymously be also knowledge. Okay, so this is still all the logical thing, and I just cited a lot of philosophical definition here. So what we are actually interested in is then the process of this, because Searle, for example, it's just logical conditions. But there's, of course, always a process involved in forming these intentional states. For example, in perception, there's the moment in time where there's no perception, and then at some point I have a perception in my mind, right? That would be the temporal axis here. And for intention and action, there's also, again, a temporal axis in the sense that here I don't have the flower in my hand, and then at some point I'll pick up the flower. And Searle actually has a term for this, which he calls condition of satisfaction. Is the fit between world to mind achieved? And you've heard this term already in Gregor's lectures, but probably related it to fields. And it was in this kind of architecture, I think, that Gregor mentioned in this talk about sequences, or maybe even one before. And this is the condition of satisfaction architecture. It was involved by Yulia Sanamirskaya, who will give the next talk, and Gregor in 2010. And this is basically an architecture that helps to organize an action in time. And because it was mentioned only Tuesday or Wednesday, I don't know, I will step through that step by step now, so to maybe you recognize it again. So it has two components here on top, two neural nodes. One will be the intention node that represents that some action is going on, and the condition of satisfaction node that represents that the action is satisfied, the fit between world to mind, right? And if I activate this intention node, then this will cause a peak to emerge in a field that I labeled here desired state, or in the past we labeled this intention field. And this peak then corresponds to a desired state I want to have. So if we think about a very simple action going from right to left, for example, this would be my desire to be in the leftmost position here. And this field of the desired state has two outputs. One is to the motor surface, which could be any architecture here that's ultimately connected to the motor surface. So it will cause our hand to move if I stay with this hand moving example. And the other outgoing connection is here to this condition of satisfaction field. And that has two inputs. And both of them are not strong enough to form a peak on their own. So on the left hand, we have this desired state input, which is here subthreshold. And then we have input from the sensory surface that's also not strong enough to form a peak here. So this would be our representation of the hand, which is now to the right side. So this peak here will then cause the whole architecture to do some action. So our hand will move, if everything is set up correctly, to the right location here. And once these two peaks overlap here, they will actually form a peak, which will activate the condition of satisfaction node. So this signals our fit is actually achieved between the desired state and our world here. And then there is an outgoing inhibitory connection seen as this dot here, which will also turn off the intention node again, which will cause this peak to vanish. And because there's no peak here anymore, the peak here will also vanish then after some time. So in the end, we've gone a full circle here and are again in our initial state, with the only change being that the sensory state, so our hand has moved here. At this point, where the condition of satisfaction node then inhibit the intention node, this causes the peak in the desired state field to vanish. And then because there's no support for the peak in the condition of satisfaction field here, this node will also deactivate. And then we are again in the same initial state that we started in, with no activation at all. But the only thing that happened is that our hand has changed. So this is the process model of intention and action, and that has been around since 2010. So you can see how this project evolves. So the next step from here we wanted to do was, okay, why not build a scenario that includes all the 6 different psychological modes that Searle mentioned. So the intention and action, the prior intention, the beliefs, the desires, and then on the other hand, perception, memory, and beliefs. And we figured out in the end that a toy scenario might be best, and we came up with this maybe strange-looking scenario where we have a robot painting. So what this robot does, it collects color here from these elongated boxes, and then applies the color on these lower boxes, and this causes then a color change. And the important part for us was here that we have one dynamic field architecture that controls the robot and makes it behave autonomously. By that we mean there are no additional algorithms or any user input that tell the robot what to do. It just does this painting by itself. And we also noticed that once we have a robot that can act in this autonomous way, we can use this actually to do some learning here, and the robot will learn its beliefs in that scenario. And I will talk about the different states in the scenario here in the next slide. So the mind-to-world states that the robot can have are on the one hand perceptions, of course, and it's perception of these objects. I mean, there's nothing else in the world. So these objects have a certain position in the world, they have a certain height, and they have a certain color. And the robot is also able to detect a changing color through a transient detector. So that's important for this painting process, right? It needs to know that it did something here. And it is also able to sort of sense stuff about its own. So it can sense where it is in the world. This is at the moment done with a simulator, so it's a bit tricky. But one could think that there's something similar to place cells, for example, that would tell the robot where it currently is in the environment. The other thing it can sense is it senses where its arm is in the world, and also it knows whether it has collected paint or not, but it doesn't know which color the paint has. It has memories in the sense that it knows where objects in the world are if it has seen them before. And the important part is here that the memory is actually in world space or allocentric space, while the perception happens in the egocentric space, so in the retinal space, or camera space rather. So there has to be a coordinate transform to be done, and I'll show you that in a sec. And the other thing is the robot learns beliefs, and the beliefs here are really these rules to paint, basically. So it learns which code color do I have to combine with which canvas or box color to get a certain result color. And there's a whole section on belief learning in the end. And the world to mind states the robot has, that's basically its action repertoire, are first the intentions and actions. So it's able to move in the one-dimensional space here. So it's a fancy 3D world, but the robot is only moving along this line here to keep it very simple. It can reach for objects in its visual field. It can pick up the color and dispense the color on objects. And what's very important is it can invoke mind-to-world states. And by that, I mean, for example, I can invoke a perception by doing a visual search, or I can invoke a certain memory by doing a recall, or I can activate a belief by having some idea which kind of color thing I want to paint. So that is very important here. And then the agent has sort of prior intentions. So it first needs to collect some color before it can then paint with that color. So this would be then an action sequence: first collect and then apply the color again. And actually all prior intentions in this scenario are of that kind. They are all action sequences, because a regular prior intention or a generic prior intention would be any action that you do when some condition arises, right? So I can have the prior intention to go get some rolls for breakfast in the morning, right? And I will only do this if it's the next day. But because there's no external conditions here that change, only the robot is acting in this scene, the only things that you can plan upon are actually actions. So all prior intentions here are actually action sequences. So I might use this synonymously. And then there's the maybe least developed part of this architecture is the desire of the robot. It has the desire to create a certain color, and this is sort of a peak that by now randomly pops up. So then it wants to suddenly create a purple cube and use then its system to do that. Okay, what I thought about for this talk is I will first flash you some bits of the entire architecture. but this is not the full architecture, and I also don't want to go into each and every detail. I just want to give you 2 examples here, so you don't have to read all of that. It's basically just another list again of the sensory motor surface and the different intentional states that are possible here. But what I want to hint your attention at is that first there's this connection from the desire field to the belief system, as I call it for now. And through this, the robot actually starts to acting, right? It has a certain desire that activates the belief system. The belief system then activates beliefs that gives me a certain code and a canvas color. And this is then used for prior intentions to sort of form an action plan, what to do. And then the robot engages in those. And the other important part is, because I'm going to mention the belief system later, is that there's also a connection from the perception field here to the belief system, which is from the color change detection, if you can read that. So if there's some color change happening in the scene, which is only happening if the robot is painting, then this acts as a reward for a learning rule for all beliefs later. But first, I want to go in some details on perception and memory. So first, to make you, like, this is always the disclaimer slide that comes in front of every architecture. So how are the fields set up? And here we use only this one-dimensional feature space. So the camera input actually can be seen here on the bottom in these different maps. And these are very similar to the scene representation you've seen yesterday from Raoul, for example. So you have, on the one hand, the solely spatial map, which shows me here that I have 3 objects, like here. And then there are these 2D maps that combine this one-dimensional spatial information with the color information, for example. So here we have a purple object on the left and then 2 yellow objects on the right. Or they can also be combined with height. It's basically a 2-dimensional version of the 3-dimensional fields Daniel showed you a couple of minutes ago. So here we have 2 small objects left and 1 higher object on the right of the camera scene. But that's not yet a perception, right? That's just the input that we can use. So we defined here a perception as sort of the emerging of any subthreshold peak that then allows the architecture to use this representation then for further processing, sort of. So here the robot perceives these objects, for example, to memorize them, or for example, to use them as a reaching target to move its arm towards to. And so we defined here this perception as this kind of selection of a peak in the sensory stream that allows us to do this. And this is maybe also shows you again how these dynamic field architectures work, in a sense. There is a name ascribed to this field, but its real functionality is always coming from the connection from the sensory surface to the rest of the architecture, right? So because this peak is exactly in between the camera image and the processes that later then use this thing, this will be the peak that represents the perception, because it allows later structures to use them. So if I flash you quickly a part of this scene representation here, the 4 fields that I showed you were here before. So here we have a camera image, the spatial map, and the space feature maps. And then we have here the selection field and the retinal selection, where I can then get the color information from. This is the very same that Gregor or Raoul showed in previous days. One thing that also Gregor told you about is that we use this kind of spatial only representation to actually calculate a coordinate transform, which is very important here for the memory. So what we do here is we take the spatial information, transform it from the retinal space to the world space here, and then recombine it with the feature information from this feature field here to get these representations in the allocentric world space, which then can be applied to the memory part of the architecture. And I actually won't be longer on this figure. I'll rather show that to you in a video. So this is the very same fields that you've seen before. So here again, we have the 2 maps, the spatial map and the space color map. Height is just not shown, it's present but not shown. Then we have the selection field here. So let me maybe let this run to explain this further. So once there's one selection going on, we have one peak here selected, and this spatial information is forwarded to this retinal selection field as a ridge. So we extract here, can extract the color information along the color dimension, right? And this color dimension is then forwarded to this field, which is spanned across color and the world space. And we can get the world space information here from this transformed version of our spatial representation. So here you can see this this has a way lower resolution than this here. You can see our allocentric representation. And this is then forwarded to our memory, and the memory is again a space color conjunction here, but this time it's a memory trace. This is the only part that's not a field, but it's not that important here right now. There are 3 objects in the memory trace already. These are the 3 boxes you can see here. So on the leftmost object would be yellow. So this is left, this is right. The middle box would be purple here. And then the right box would be blue. And this object that I'm currently attending, which is the purple high object, will then be soon added to this memory field here. And the same thing will then happen again if the other part here is selected. So a peak will shortly come up here on the left side, cause a ridge here, cause a peak here. And the only feature that I also want to show you here is basically how we use this memory trace. And maybe let me pause here at the right point in time. So if we look at this object again, and Gregor mentioned this in his talk, this memory trace has actually some interference going on. So whenever a new peak is building there or a new memory trace is built up, other memory traces decay. But it's only changing whenever something else builds up. So we want this interference, of course, to happen, to have some kind of capacity limit that is in here. But we don't want to change the memory trace each time we look at an object that's in front of us. So this way, we have a memory selection field here that inhibits this thing, which is called the memory gate for exactly that reason. So what happens here as we look at the object for a second time is that no peak will emerge here because there's some inhibition going on, because this object is already represented in memory. And this then also happens for the other object. So a peak will emerge here first, and then it will be inhibited here. So no change to the memory trace because we know these objects already. Okay, so far, this was one example how the perception, for example, is used to memory formation here. And I want to now show an example from the other side, from the world to mind direction of fit. And this would be the architecture that allows the robot to drive from left to right or from right to left. And as you've already seen from my previous example, it contains exactly the same components that you've seen before, in the sense, here's an intention node, here's a condition of satisfaction node, and then the same intention field and condition of satisfaction field here. So the new thing here that I want to show you is basically how this peak actually emerges in that intention field, because I left that out previously. And this, of course, depends on your overall architecture in a whole. And here in this specific example, the agent always drives to a location it remembered previously. So it's somehow guided by memory where to go. And for this, to achieve this, we have this gating field here, which receives on the one hand information from the memory trace, but it's a gating field because it only activates if a boost from a top-down prior intention, here the locate prior intention, also boost this field. So only when we have this locate prior intention going on, then a peak will be established here and will be forwarded to this field. And these top-down arrows here always stand for prior intentions that drive the whole behavior. And I'll come to that soon. The only thing I want to just show you here is what's below this intention field is now what was previously motor surface and sensor surface. And you can see that this is pretty much the same here. We have a neural oscillator that generates velocities for the wheels, and it's then applied to the wheel motors. And also we have a position sensor here that is then fed back into the system. And ultimately, this is then compared here in the condition of satisfaction field. And what I now want to show you, this was basically just an implementation of the example from before. What I want to show you now, and Mathis also showed you yesterday, is how this can be then integrated with other actions, because you can see already here's something going out, visual search. So to maybe show you this complete action sequence here, or prior intention of locating, it consists here of 3 actions. So recall would be the first thing. So I need to recall a certain position. Then I want to drive there. And once I'm there, I have to actually visually search for the thing I'm looking for, the thing I want to locate. And these are here connected to these precondition nodes. And I think Mathis explained these. So they work in a sense that they, per default, they inhibit a certain behavior. But if a condition of satisfaction of a previous behavior here is reached, this will inhibit the precondition node, and then double negation sort of, this will be activated. And which kind of behaviors and which preconditions belong to a sequence is always determined by the connections from that prior intention to the lower level behaviors here. So we sort of have a hierarchy of behaviors in here. And this is a hierarchy, of course, because this is already, as you can see, kind of the same thing all over again. It's an attention node coupled to a condition of satisfaction node. It just things that happen are not directly motor actions, but they cause motor actions in the end. And the condition of satisfaction of this can also be anything of the sequence. And here, of course, it would be the logical endpoint. I want to locate something, and I've located it if I've successfully done a visual search for it. So this is why the visual search part here activates the locate condition of satisfaction. And you can then think, of course, that even on a higher hierarchical level, I can also have another sequence. So after I located an object, I want to reach for that object. And this again is then led by a different prior intention, which is here collect. So on the same level as maybe apply color, for example. So again, I want to show you here a concrete video example, which might make this a bit more easily to grasp. So here we have one sequence of collecting a certain color. So the first things that happen is that through the belief system, and I pause here maybe, two peaks come up in this collect color field and the collect height field. They specify the kind of object we want to have. We want to have a purple object with a high height, a tall object. And then this is forwarded to the memory selections system as part of the recall action, sort of. And it helps us through this ridge overlap to find the region that most overlaps with that. And that's, of course, the place where there's a tall object as well as a purple object. And this is then initiates the driving behavior. And you can see this here maybe to show you how this mapping works. This would be on the right-hand side here. The current position is somewhere on the left here. And this is the condition of satisfaction field that compares these two. So the robot is driving towards the purple object. And once it's at that position, this behavior actually ends and initiates the visual search. And then, oh, this went way too fast. Visual search engages. This was previously below threshold, but after we have the condition of satisfaction here, this was boosted. And once the visual search is done, which is pretty fast because you have only one object here, this will also have a condition of satisfaction. And you can maybe see that this happened at the same amount or shortly after this came up here, this condition of satisfaction, the reach started. And this will then cause the robot to reach towards the object it wants to collect color from. So these were these two examples for, on the one hand, actions and action sequences, and for perception and memory. And now I want to talk a bit about the belief learning in this last part of the talk. So when I talk here about belief learning or autonomous learning, that often causes a lot of confusion. So what I mean by autonomous learning here is really the autonomous learning from experience, which can be contrasted, for example, from learning from data, as it's currently in with deep neural networks, for example. So in order to do this, we need this robot that does autonomous action and also generates meaningful experience. And by meaningful, I mean here, because we have this explicit intentional state representation of the action we are currently doing and of the things we are perceiving, we can actually use this experience to learn something. This learning is maybe related more to reinforcement learning, for example, where you also act in order to learn. But reinforcement learning then is more interested in learning a particular action or understanding how something works. It's more interested in finding good methods of exploration versus exploitation, for example. Well, here, this scenario is, of course, heavily pre-structured. But as I'm going to show you, it's still, although it's very simple, and the robot, for example, doesn't need to learn how the painting action works, it should only learn which color combined with which other color yields which third color. It's still quite complicated. And if you look at the concrete things that we are trying to model, that, for example, reinforcement learning models do not care about, which is how can this learning be temporally organized in a neural way? And yeah, I'll show you that in a second. So first, the things that we want to achieve with this belief learning system is, first, we want to be able to learn from a single episode. So an episode would be the robot collects some purple color, then applies this on a yellow canvas here, for example, and observes that this changed to a blue color. And we now want to take this triple kind of and make one coherent entity out of it that we can then learn as a belief. And if we want to use this entity then later, if we, for example, have the desire to paint something blue, we can call on this belief that then gives us, this is the purple color and the yellow, and this way you can get blue. And because this knowledge is, of course, not always perfect, we also want to make sure that if we then later, for example, use this belief and somehow the world changed or whatever, we came to the conclusion that, or we observe that using the same rule as before yields a different result, we want to notice that, right? We want to notice that we have had a belief and that's not longer valid anymore. I'll again flesh here a part of the overall architecture that's concerned with the belief learning. But before, I will only go into certain details here. So the main part of this architecture is actually this set here of neural nodes. So on the top here, we have different belief nodes, B1 to Bn. And on the bottom row, we have again concept nodes, which stand for different colors, but also different behavior. So here would be code concept nodes, here canvas concept nodes, and here result concept nodes. And the belief would then mean that we have a belief node here that has learned a connection between these different concept nodes. So this belief that says red on green results in a blue color has connections to the red node here, here to the green node, and here to the blue one. While similarly, another belief that says blue on cyan results in red has connections to exactly these concept nodes down here. Okay, but and these concept nodes gain their meaning sort of again through connection to the sensory surface ultimately and through the action. So they are connected to three different role fields here, the code color field, the canvas color field, and these themselves guide the prior intentions on the one hand, but are also driven by perception. So if the agent is currently collecting color, the perceived color will be filled into this field here. While also, if the agent is looking for some color, it will draw the information from this field. So it's used in both directions. And the same is done for the canvas color and the result color field. And this gives these concept nodes their meaning. And there's these big connections here mean that there's a reciprocal connection. So if I turn on this red concept node, a peak will here activate in red. But also the other way around, if I activate a peak here at blue, it will activate the blue concept node. Yeah, so it's basically just another dimension, a discretized version of the representation in here, not more. So how can we then learn a belief? And the main danger is here, we don't want to override, we don't want to forget our old beliefs while learning new ones. But if we see the same belief again that we have seen before, we also don't want to learn it twice, right? So we have to detect always, does the belief that we have present in our fields here actually match a belief that we already have? And for that, we were actually heavily inspired by Carpenter's Grossberg adaptive resonance theory. So if you're familiar with that, some of that here might look familiar to you, maybe. So if we now engage in the painting process, at some point, there will a peak form here in the code color field, and that will then activate the code color concept. And because here's again, this learn connections also goes in both directions, this will activate the belief 2 node, because currently this blue color at the beginning matches belief 2. But when we then, the agent is freely exploring, it will then choose the green color to paint on. This will activate the green color node. This does not match any active belief anymore because it activates B2, but it also activates B1, but not both of them. We have to make sure that these beliefs are not activated. And for that, we have actually a connection here from all concepts that inhibits these belief nodes to make sure that that they only activate if there's a perfect match between the number of active concepts and the concepts they are actually connected to. And here again is the reference to the adaptive resonance theory. So because the agent experiences this completely new unseen belief, it will see that this actually changes to purple, results in a purple color. This is again filled through perception here. We now have these 3 concept nodes active, and we want to associate them now with any of the belief nodes here on the right side that have not learned something before. And for that, we actually use a set of memory nodes here in the top. Those of you who've done the sequence exercise, maybe they might recognize this. These C1 and C2 nodes get activated here and inhibit nodes that have been associated with something before. And then all other nodes will be boosted by the node that tells me that something has changed in the scene. That was the one I showed at the very beginning, a few slides back. So this will then cause a random belief to activate that has not been previously activated, here in this case B4. And B4 will also activate its commitment node here. And once we have an active belief node and active concept nodes, we use here a reward-based Hebbian learning rule to form a connection between these. And we use the same learning rule also to form a connection here to this commitment node, so that if we now see another belief, C4 would also not be able to be associated with that belief. Okay, so much from these architecture flashes. So I again have a video, 3rd time's the charm. That's the last video of the talk. So in this talk, I just want to show you how this belief system is then used to actually paint something. So one complete painting sequence here. And it all starts with some result color coming up here, which will activate a concept node, which will then activate a matching belief node that then activates its concepts and therefore fills these canvas and code color role fields here. And this now causes the agent, it says fast forward, but I'll probably stop it rather. So the agent will now look for a blue high object and a purple box object to then paint upon, and it will expect that the result color will be yellow. And in this example though, I'll show you, I continue while I'm talking. In this example though, I changed the environment a bit, or the rules here, so it will actually not result in yellow as the agent expects. And this will then be detected through this condition of dissatisfaction detector here any moment. And this is sort of the 3rd case that I wanted to show you, that if I reuse a belief that I've previously known, but it actually returns something different, you can see the change coming up here, then I want to do something about it. And what this change detector here does, it inhibits all other beliefs to associate then the new combination that I newly observed with a different belief node. The old one is not really forgotten, although one might think that this might be intuitive, but we are not really sure which is now the real true belief. So we keep both of these alive, and it might be another higher cognitive task to now figure out if we really should never apply the previous rule again, for example. But yeah, the important part on this is that these fields here are connected to in both directions. So it's fed by the concept nodes through the active belief, but perception is always a stronger input here. So whenever perception does not match the current belief node, the perception will override that belief. Yeah. So this basically concludes my talk. I hope, I know there was a lot of stuff to digest, so I hope you could at least see the gist here. The idea is really that we want to go from the sensory-motor surface to these abstract belief representations, and we want to do this with a dynamic field architecture that autonomously behaves in time. And as you can see, even if everything is pre-structured, like the agent knows how to do this action sequence, it still requires a lot of neural infrastructure to still organize the learning, to not come into any scheme of forgetting, for example. And then as an outlook, maybe, Sophie Erdker who started her PhD last year, I believe. Time flies in Corona times. Yeah, she's now taking this belief architecture here, and she's more generalizing it now. I use this very specific code canvas result color fields here, and she's now extending this in a more general scenario where we're actually linking different actions with different outcomes using, for example, action objects like tools or something like that. And she also did publish a paper this year in ICDL, which was modeling infant habituation task. And I didn't talk about desire at all, as you might have noticed, because we haven't developed that at all. And one interesting part would here be, how does desire arise and when it is satisfied? And we thought that looking at infants and maybe their habituation might give some insightful ideas here. But we haven't applied that yet. So that was all. Again, I mean, that's probably not news, but anyone who wants to try out modeling themselves, maybe try out our software CEDAR. And yeah, any questions, I'm delighted to answer.